Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City or Sao Paulo, Brazil, or Miami, Florida, for example. Good evening if you are in Stuttgart, Germany. Good overnight if you are somewhere in Asia or Australia or Oceania, or greetings to the penguins who follow us in Antarctica. It is Friday. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is an audio and video streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all over the world. I want listeners to know today that today's show is a little different because it's being broadcast on April 12th of 2024, but it's being recorded before because my guest today, Justin Austin, a baritone, is one of the busiest young people in all of the opera world and perhaps all of the music world. And I was able to capture him for a recording a few days before because he is doing a concert tomorrow in Iowa that we will talk about. He has all kinds of things coming up. Justin, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Fred.
So, um, what I first want to mention about Justin Austin, whom I've not met yet, I've heard him, but I've not met him, is the phenomenon around him reminds me of something from my early career when everyone said to me in about 1983, 84, have you heard of this Thomas Hampson guy? He's everywhere. He's sung in Europe and he's about to do his Carnegie Hall recital debut. And then he's coming to the Met. And then he's doing this. And he's very bright and he's very ambitious, but he's very kind and he's very generous and he has a wonderful artistic soul. And on and on and on and on about my now friend Thomas Hampson. Um, and I've not heard that kind of discussion about anyone until Justin Austin. And there are so many people in our business who have spoken to me about you and have had wonderful things to say about you. I'm not going to fill your head with it all right now, maybe a little. But I want you to know, Justin, that I've never experienced this since Thomas Hampson some 40 plus years ago of this kind of buzz around an artist. And so, number one, congratulations. Number two, is it a burden?
Wow, I wouldn't call it a burden. I would call it a responsibility
Hmm.
that I have maintained for a lifetime now. My both of my parents were opera singers, and it's always been something that I've wanted to do and something that I've taken very seriously. Um, to be honest with you, I didn't really know what you just shared until you just shared it. So that's really nice to hear, especially because Thomas Hampson is one of my close mentors, and I definitely look up to him and have always, strived to be like him in a lot of ways. And so that wow, that fills me with a lot of emotions to hear that from you right now.
Well, I'm glad to know that. I'm glad to know that Tom is a mentor to you because there's no better mentor than that. Um, although there are many as good, like Catherine Malfitano, to name another one,
Absolutely.
um, who is an old dear friend of mine. But I guess what I'm wondering about, because I really have never met you, I know that you were born in Stuttgart, Germany, and your parents are opera singers. Talk about growing up in that kind of setting. And what I'm referring to specifically is I've known families of multi-generational artists where it's kind of the family business. For
Right.
example, the Serafine family in Vienna, the father is very famous in operetta. The daughter is a dramatic soprano, Martina, not Martina. Is it Martina? I'm sorry. Marina, I'm not remembering right now. And the son, Daniel, became a baritone and now he's an arts administrator, runs an opera festival, and it goes back in their family. I imagine the Strauss family in Vienna is a family business. The Puccini family over many generations, they were all in the family business of music. And it must be different than when I meet people who say, I came from a background where nobody did anything like that. So, what's it like
Mm.
growing up in a family where your parents do what you wound up doing?
Well, it's a very loud household, a very very musical and magical upbringing. Really, I learned so much, not from just them, but all of their friends and colleagues that were also musicians, classical musicians. And I always felt that there was a place for me. I have a lot of colleagues, particularly opera singers and classical singers that are of color, and they feel that their upbringing in their upbringing they didn't really feel like opera was for them or they were allowed in. And at the same time as I completely understand that and respect and understand the validity in that, I didn't have that experience. I was never told that, or even, I don't know, there was never a hint of this wasn't for me or this wasn't available to me. And I am so grateful now on the other side of my youth uh, that I was never discouraged. I was always encouraged from my family members, but also the outside world, at least in my little bubble. And it was really enriching, and I valued every second of it. I was a child performer. I was a boy soprano, singing boy soprano roles as well as traveling with boy choirs, and it was, I don't know, I feel like I was born into this wonderland of classical music and music in general. And I have stayed in it and been honored to stay in it my whole life. A lot of my colleagues that were young boy sopranos at the infamous voice change, they went on to do other things. And I was certain that I wanted to stay in the world of music and particularly in the world of singing. And I just told my mom we have to do whatever we have to do to for me to be able to figure out this voice change and so I can continue to pursue my dreams. And she encouraged and supported that. And we moved to New York, and as they say, the rest is history.
So I want to know, I don't ask people private lives, but I want to know a little bit more about your parents in that what voice did your father have and what voice did your mother have in terms of talking about soprano, mezzo, tenor? What voices
Right.
were
My father was a tenor,
okay?
and my mother was a mezzo soprano.
Okay. I
Yeah.
asked because in an operatic party game that I would love to play, imagining having parents where one is a tenor and one is a mezzo, and what roles they play in the house. Does the father take on, more sort of heroic tenor, romantic tenor, nervous tenor? Does the mother become the sexy mezzo, the practical mezzo? Um, the variety of possibilities are infinite. And what I mean, part of what I asked you before about the family business is that perhaps there are people who check it at the door when they come into their homes and become parents and partners and so on. But then I've seen many households where um when Tosca comes home from singing, she's still Tosca in the kitchen, or she's still Tosca wherever she is. And when Mario Cavaradossi comes home, and maybe when Scarpia comes, who knows? You don't want to let them near the kitchen tools. But um, what I mean is the separation from the working life to the home life.
Mm-hmm.
And in your home, did they bring the work home, so to speak, or was it more familial and then work was discussed on the side?
Well, that's a very good question. For my mother, because she was a mezzo, I often feel mezzos don't get enough credit for what they are able to do and what they do in the world of opera. She did a little bit of everything, right? She was the hero. She was the caretaker. She was, the sexy Carmen. She was everything. And when she came home, she would also be everything. There were times when she had to be the school teacher. There were times when she had to be the disciplinarian. She had to be the chef. She had to be the
Mhm.
gardener. You know, she had to be everything, just like a lot of mothers do today. And in history, she's one of my heroes because of that. And that's pretty much whatever role was needed, uh, she filled in the
Mhm.
household. My father, he was one that sort of kind of checked it at the door, and became this very fun, loving, intelligent person that was always eager to help and to have a very intellectual conversation. And the Tinners, uh, for some reason, have a weird reputation of not always being the brightest person in the room. But my father is always the brightest person in the room,
Yeah.
intellectually, but also personality wise. And he lights up a room. His smile, his sense of humor, and the joy that he exudes from his spirit. And yeah, for me, I think that I've had difficulty checking checking it at the door. I think that it's important, as I have matured and as I have taken my role as a husband and a family man seriously. I've understood the value of not bringing all of that performance energy home. Sometimes it just happens, and we can't do anything about that. But I try to be as conscious as I can so I don't overwhelm my wonderful wife with all of all of the energy from the Metropolitan Opera or the Lyric Opera of Chicago, and just just kind of overload her with all of that. So
Is your wife
I
in
try
this
to do my
business
best.
in any way?
Say again.
Sorry, is your wife in this business in any way, or is she lucky?
Absolutely. We actually met at the Manhattan School of Music.
Okay,
Her name is Amanda Austin, and
okay.
she is a phenomenal soprano. She's also a visual artist, a painter, and a sculptor. And she develops her own projects that kind of join those two worlds together.
Hmm.
And I am on a long list of people waiting to be able to collaborate with her myself.
Hmm. Um, you're quite young, so I'm guessing you never met the famous mezzo soprano, originally soprano Regina Resnick.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I knew Regina very well. We worked together a lot. Her husband was a world famous painter,
Oh, wow.
and her second husband. And for many, many years, they were sort of an artistic couple. That she was not only a great singer and teacher, but later became a stage director and very formidable, very opinionated in a good way. She had very strong political opinions. She had very strong aesthetic opinions. She was liberal in the very best sense of the word, and open, tolerant, but no BS, no nonsense with her. Her husband was the classic Arbit Blottis was his name, capricious artist, and had none of the sort of grounded mezzo soprano quality that we were talking about before.
Mm.
He would have flights of fantasy and inspiration, and would, you put a scallop in front of him and he would rhapsodize about the scallop or complain to the waiter. And everything was the diva behavior that we think of for divas that actually is not very true. Most
Right.
divas that I know are very solid, able, collaborative people. But he was not. But I mention that because they made it such an interesting couple because his visual artist sense and his works were hung in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Louvre. He was at that level, and in
Mm.
Venice where they lived. But he would design things for her that inspired her music making or her
Wow.
design for a production. They did a very famous Carmen together in Europe. They did an Electra. She played Clytemnestra. and he designed the production. And the Met used to have the painting of that in its founders hall. And so I always find it wonderful and interesting when I meet couples who are both devoted to their art forms. And in the case of Amanda, I think you said her name is, she is a singer, but also a visual artist. I was fortunate to study with Tito Gobi, who was a very fine caricaturist, and he would draw all of his characters and design the makeup and the facial expressions and the moods. And he could pull out a folder and say, "This is my Iago, this is my Falstaff, this is my
Wow.
Scarpia." And he would
Wow.
evolve his thinking about his interpretation through what he drew.
Mm.
Whereas most singers I know will look at the score, will look at the text, will read the background. But with Tito, it was a matter of drawing, literally drawing with his hand out what he understood or came to understand his characters to be.
Wow.
So
Wow.
have you and your wife talked visual arts and singing and how they connect, if they connect?
Absolutely. In multiple different ways and vantage points. Firstly, my my wife has a project, which is a series called Records, and basically, she has an art piece that she creates in real time while performing music. And by the end of the performance, there is a visual record of
Mhm.
the music, right? Um, and so she has dedicated her time and talents to producing this event, and she did it herself, the first few iterations of it. So she sort of kind of knew what the demands were, and now she's working with other singers, basically directing and artistic directing the project, but featuring them. So she definitely finds lots of opportunities. She is the founder of a nonprofit organization called the Omni Arts Foundation that is literally designed for multidisciplinary artists and people who want to collaborate with other art forms and bringing them together and see what they come up with. But as far as I'm concerned, I um, in tomorrow I give a performance, a solar recital presented by the Des Moines Metro Opera, and it's sort of a preview, if you will, to my return this summer, starring in the opera American Apollo by Damien Jeter and Lila Palmer, which is a beautiful story that connects the world of visual art and opera, surrounding the artwork of John Singer Sargent and his primary muse, Thomas McKellar. And I've been working on this project for a very long time, having done the first iterations of the chamber version and also the workshops leading up to the world premiere this summer. And one of the things that has prepared me that has prepared me for this moment is actually modeling for my wife Amanda,
Mhm.
because I have to play a figure model on stage. There are lots of intricacies of uh, how um, how that happens, and being able to kind of practice that and being able to bring certain um, knowledge into the rehearsal room to be able to portray that character even more realistically and authentically. That was a result of my work with my wife. So we there are lots of collaborations that we've done officially and unofficially that have absolutely been a part of my trajectory.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit because you triggered something that I think about, but I don't get to talk to people about too much. This may sound like a facile and convenient question, but it's very serious. Um, I meet people all the time who attend opera, who work in opera, who have very strong opinions about opera, and especially people in your generation tend to say that they want action on the stage. They want movement. They want to see what's going on. It results in directors choreographing overtures, whereas in Verdi's time you might have just listened to the overture, or Rossini's time, or Mozart's time. Um, and there are certain singers who are older now in their 70s and 80s who famously didn't move all that much on the stage, not because they were heavy and couldn't move, but it was the way they trained, it was the way they expressed. I will name two names publicly of marvelous singers who didn't move often. Mariella de Villa, the wonderful coloratura soprano, never moved. She just stood and she did the most still Lucia di Lammermoor mad scene you'll ever see.
Mm,
Musically, it was sublime, but she really almost didn't move. Kiri Tsikhanova moved more than she was accused of, but a lot of people said that she just sort of stood in place. My
mm,
feeling about her is that she sounded so glorious and was so compelling just to listen to standing there, that if she sings something like Come Scoglio or Dove Sono from Le Nozze di Figaro, where the character is meditative, she doesn't have to move. If
mm.
you're doing Deflator Mouse, you have to move, and she certainly did. But I suppose my question is, given that you just said that you have done modeling for your wife, and you will be playing a model and a muse in the upcoming opera, American Apollo, um, modeling, I've done it once for a painting, requires stillness. It requires focus and meditation and mental energy. It's not, you're not sitting there zoning out and doing your shopping list. It
Right.
requires an energy because when one is modeling, I think you're not presenting just a visual, but an aura, a persona,
So,
and that comes from within, from the heart and the brain and elsewhere. But I suppose my question is, when you approach music, when you approach a role, or whether it's a recital music, do you factor in the physicalization, or could you be a singer who could stand still? As I said, I've never seen you in recital. Um, who can stand still and let the music and your soul and your voice do the work.
I think that it all depends. It really depends on what the role is asking for. Who the character is, what the world of the piece is. I think that opera in general is one of the greatest examples of celebrating humanity, and telling the story of humanity. And um, there are so many facets of being a human being. And although we have evolved, there are certain traits of being a human that don't change.
Mhm.
And whether we are telling a story that's hundreds of years old, or if we're telling a story of today, there are certain things that the audience are always going to connect with because of our honesty throughout the experience of telling that story of those humans, right? And I think that sometimes movement is absolutely necessary.
Mhm.
And at the same time, I think stillness is absolutely necessary. It really just depends. I think in recital, one thing that I'm sort of kind of, and I guess getting attention and notoriety for is in my recitals. It's become almost this radical event that I don't stand at the crook of the piano and just, in a very still way, sing my songs. I make the stage my own, and I transform uh, the stage into my set. And I think that I don't deserve any extra credit for that or any extra comment on that. I think it's important for us to embody these people. I think it's important for us to use our humanity and to use our bodies to tell these stories, because our voice isn't is just one part of the instrument, right? And also the vocal cords are just one part of the voice, where our when I'm singing, I'm using my toes, right? I'm using my calf muscles, I'm using my glutes. And I think having access to all of that and having awareness, and kind of buoyancy and flexibility within that allows uh, you to kind of be a little bit more in the moment, allows you to connect more to the words you're saying, right? Because we are one of the only instruments that actually has the benefit of language and words. So being able to lean into that, and then also, I think it helps your vocalism. I think it can really, do a disservice to your vocalism if you are moving too much, right? Or if you're moving in ways that don't make any sense to, the story. But I think that's where research and planning and, you know, basically doing your due diligence as an artist comes into play, and making sure that all of it is connected, and that you are creating something in that moment that you are introducing to the world, even though it is material that people might be familiar with, right? And I think that's what makes us artists as singers,
Mhm.
or else we wouldn't be artists, because an artist is someone who takes something that hasn't ever been created before, creates it and puts it into the world, right? So if we're just, Tom Hampson calls it reading the news. If we're just reading the news, that's not art, right? So I think what makes it special is having opportunities and taking opportunities, whether it's through movement or stillness or whatever it is, to allow that moment to not just be the characters, not just be yours, but it being a shared experience.
Mhm. I fully agree with you. I will only add that I think that sometimes, a lot of times, it takes courage and confidence for a singer just to stand completely still,
Yes,
because then that requires the audience to focus entirely on her voice and her singing.
right.
Um, there are singers for whom costuming on the stage in recital, I don't mean in opera,
Hmm.
what they wear is very important. And there are other singers for whom the attire should almost sink into the background.
Mm.
I recently saw a man who wore a sort of neutral gray, black tunic kind of thing that revealed his throat. He arranged that the light be shown on his face so that we almost didn't see his clothing.
Wow.
We saw his hands to some degree, but he didn't use them a lot. And we were asked, literally, not literally in the sense he didn't say, please listen. We were asked by his presentation to focus on his face and on the words and the music. And it was very compelling, but it took a lot of work from audience
Mm.
members who were not used to that. And frankly, some of them said to me they were bored. And I said,
Mm.
I'm sorry, but I found this absolutely riveting
Right.
because there were no externals, or he minimized the externals so that
Right.
it was just a matter of focusing on what he had to say as a singer at that moment.
Absolutely,
Um,
and I think there's a
yeah.
there's an extraordinary beauty to that,
Mhm.
and I think what it takes, what it requires from the audience is their due diligence, right, as well, right? Is them
Mhm.
being able to stay invested and to be able to pay attention. I think that there's always motion, right? I think the beauty is in the motion and in the movement. But I think sometimes when we're still, then that allows it to be clear the other parts that are moving, the other motion, that when we sit down and look at the stars and realize when we are still, that how little we are, and compared to the vast universe, and we can hear, if we really concentrate, we can hear all the movement around us, that sort of tells a story in its own way. And I think when you kind of can take moments to just be still and to allow the music to shine, allow the music to move. I think it could reach people more directly sometimes than you trying to force feed them through your actions and through your
Mhm.
movement. And it really, again, I'm a big subscriber and fan of both schools of thought. It just depends on what the piece calls for.
Um, I want there's something funny happening. I don't mind. I want listeners to know that on Justin's screen, occasionally a thumbs up happens in a gray
Oh.
bubble. And I agree, but I just want listeners to know that it's your computer who likes what you're saying. I do too like it, but I'm not the one putting the thumbs up.
That's so funny. I didn't realize that.
So,
Wow.
given that we're taping this, Justin, when you see it, you will see that occasionally you've said something very smart, and then you got a thumbs up from your computer.
Oh, that's
Just at
hilarious.
the right moment. Anyway, um, part of what I'm talking about movement is something that about your mother that you said that I thought was so interesting about her having to be a factotum to do many different roles and be many different things. One of the roles in your repertory is Figaro in Rossini's Barbara of Seville, Barbiere di Siviglia, who
Mhm.
sings the famous entry aria, Largo al factotum, make way for the factotum, the man who does it all. That's a role that requires movement, it seems to me. It's in the music, it's in the character. He has to be adept in Quicksilver and and know how to respond to all the situations that present themselves. When I've taught that role, I'm a big Rossini lover. Um, what I teach the young men, and you can disagree with me if you wish, about the character of Figaro is in an opera full of love confusion. To me, he's sexless. He doesn't seem to be working for romance or capturing the woman or the man or whatever. He's there to do his business and conduct his business and, cut as many hair and make wigs and give shaves and move on. And he has his case ready. And when I've said this to baritones who play this, who tend to be, rich voiced and sexy and earthy and so on, they get a little disappointed. Am I wrong? I just see him as, if I direct it, as the guy who's there to make the engine run, but he's not looking for any action while everybody else in the opera is.
I completely agree. I think he is uh, focused on his empire.
Mhm.
He's very business oriented, and I think that he could. I think that he is very capable of being romantic, but I think that he just in the span of the story, he just doesn't he doesn't want to. He has no ambitions of romantically pursuing anyone. He has other ambitions, and I think that he is aware of himself,
Mhm.
and I also think that he's aware of how um, other people's uh, romantic ambition, he can make use of that.
Mhm.
Mm.
I find it interesting too because in the other of the famous Figaro operas, there are many Figaro operas. He gets married, he's engaged. We meet his mother. He doesn't know it's his mother. We meet his boss, the Count. We meet his other boss, the Countess, who happens to be Rosina, who is the Count and the Countess are the people we meet young in the Barber of Seville. And
Mm-hmm.
they're a little older and their marriage hasn't worked out. And have you played that Figaro, or is he more of a bass? In other words, the
Yes, I
Mozart
have
Figaro?
not played that Figaro. I have admired that Figaro. I'm a huge Bryn Terfel fan.
Yeah, I'm too.
So I've absolutely um, studied that role just for fun. But it is not my voice. I am a high lyric baritone, and uh, uh, Barbiere is right up my alley. But the other iterations, not so
Yeah.
much.
So name me some roles because you are still young and at the not quite the dawn of your career because you've been performing since you're four, but in the period since your voice changed and you did formal training and so forth, what are roles that you would like to study and eventually perhaps perform? I know always with voices that they go one way sometimes and we think they're going another way. So,
Mm.
but certain roles that inspire you across the operatic spectrum that are you not just vocally in terms of Fach, in other words, a vocal fit, but spiritually.
I have had the immense privilege and honor to sing a lot of all kinds of different roles. Um, from the things I was studying in conservatory through my professional life, in the world of contemporary and standard repertoire. But I think what hasn't come across the desk or the diary yet, for some strange reason, is Papageno, which
Uh-huh.
is like the most performed baritone role of all
Yeah.
time, is the one thing I haven't done. And I think it would be so much fun to do. At the same time, I think it would be artistically satisfying because he is a very complicated character that a lot of times uh, people just kind of make fun of and gloss over. But I think it's a very he's a fascinating character. He's a tortured character, and I think the element of the fact that he's cursed, you know, um, and there's there's a deep desire to live,
Hmm.
and I think ironically that's why he gets to the point of being suicidal. It's because he has this deep desire to live and feels like he can't. And I think that for a lot of people, that's a story they can empathize with. And yes, he has very funny moments, but I think there's a realness to Papageno that I would love to explore and portray at some point in my career.
For listeners who may not know, the opera The Magic Flute is Zauberflöte by Mozart it premiered in the autumn, I think September 30th, but I'm not certain, of 1791, right around there. And Mozart died December 5th of 1791. His illness was upon him. It's often referred to as his last opera. It's not, actually. He wrote
Mm,
most of it in the spring of 1791. And then in sort of June, July, he wrote La Clemenza di Tito, which I consider his last opera,
okay.
even though it's not the last one to be produced. Mozart wrote the overture and a couple of little bits for the Magic Flute for Die Zauberflöte in September of 1791. The librettist was Emanuel Schikaneder, who played Papageno. He was a Mason. He was part of a group of men only, frankly, who helped support Mozart financially and to some degree spiritually in the last year of his life. Mozart may have had some foreboding about his imminent death. I don't think so. I don't know. He died officially of kidney failure on December 5th. But the fact that he wrote or did not finish his Requiem, people think he was writing his own Requiem. He did that on commission. He also wrote
Mm,
very joyous things like the clarinet music that he discovered late in life, the clarinet, as played by Johann Stadler. So you hear clarinet in Magic Flute, but in especially in La Clemenza di Tito for Sesto.
mm,
And so for that reason, um, it's an opera, The Magic Flute, that It's magnificent, and I think it's one of the hardest operas to stage. It's widely misunderstood. Put in the hand of the wrong stage director, it could be the longest evening in opera. Put in the hand of the right stage director, it's magnificent and thrilling and inspiring. Um, every role that you cast and the way it is interpreted can change the whole opera.
Mm,
Because if this, I'm starting really now with the stage director has an agenda about what the opera is about, uh, it tends to filter through that. Because Schikaneder played Papageno, he wrote himself a juicy part, but he also, I think, was our audience member's interpreter. He was the person, the interlocutor between what was happening in the story of the opera. He was the mensch, the working man, who also addressed the audience. This was not done at something like the Vienna State Opera. There was not Vienna State Opera yet. Um, not even at the Theater der Wien, but it was a local company where working class Viennese people would go for an evening's entertainment, kind of like going to a Broadway show that just happened to have the greatest music and profundity and a strong homage to the beliefs of the Masons, because Mozart
mm,
was a Mason, Schikaneder a Mason. But what I'm saying is, it can give so much leeway and latitude to the stage director, to each performer, and put in the wrong hands, it's ghastly, but put in the right hands, and it's absolutely thrilling. And what you just described about the character Papageno, I've not heard other baritones articulate. Some of them have
mm,
played it that way. Um, Herman Pry, who I think was
mm,
my first Papageno, um, played it that way with a lot more existential concern about his life and so on.
mm,
Because yes, there is the prospect of suicide. He puts a noose around his neck and he says, Eins, zwei, and he hopes that someone will come and save him, and but there does not seem to be any person coming at first.
mm,
Um, I I always wonder what would happen if he had a different relationship with Pamina,
mm.
because he's the one more than Tamina who actually has a relationship with Pamina. And the
Absolutely.
humanizing happens there. People forget that. They always talk about the Tamino Pamina, Papageno Papagena. But
Mm,
me, the central relationship in the opera, there are two. One is Pamina Papageno, and the other is the Queen of the Night and Sarastro, who are
mm,
antagonists. And but they're the antagonists, but the potential for human comprehension happens with Papageno and Pamina. But
absolutely.
sometimes he's played as such an idiot that we don't get that part of him. And I'm very happy that you immediately articulated this human side of him.
Mm.
Um, so what happens if you bring this wonderful concept and you wind up with a stage director who wants to turn him into Figaro?
Well, then I am at the mercy of the director,
Yeah.
and I will find what that is. In my opinion, I think that is one of the most fun parts about being an opera singer is being flexible and basically encountering something or coming across something that doesn't quite make sense to you, and you having to make sense of it,
Mhm.
to the point where it's not just clear to you, but it's clear to everyone else as well. You know, um, so yeah, I would just have to listen to whatever the conductor and the director has to say, and find a way to make it mine, and find a way to make it intelligible, and make it make sense to me.
When I was at the start of my career, I began as a teenager at the Lyric Opera of Chicago in the 1970s. I met singers, musicians, and so on who got their training before there were recordings. It makes me
Hmm,
sound ancient. I'm not. But they were old enough and they started early enough. Krista Ludwig being one example of someone who did not have recordings to access, so that her experience of a role and of interpretation, developing the role, came from the scores,
Mm.
came from performances she may have attended in Germany right after the Second World War, came from talking to maestros, to colleagues, to stage directors, and forming it that way. People of my generation, and I'm guessing your generation, often began their study of a role by listening to recordings.
Mm.
And that they can say, as I would have just now, that the Herman Pry Papageno was X, and let's say the Simon Keeley side was Y, and pick another was, I don't know, you can pick any Papageno you want.
Mm.
Would be another with Thomas Allen, maybe he did it once. Whoever did the Papageno, that we tend to frame them with the performer, whereas in the past it would have come from what we found in the source material. When you
Interesting.
develop a role, do you go to existing recordings and videos now, or do you go to the source material first? If we're talking about an old classical role, not a new
Right,
role. Yeah.
right, right. I think when I was a student, I would go to YouTube or the video or the video library, or the catalog in the library at school, and watch and see how the greats did it, and see, and try to glean and learn as much as I can from that. And I think, you know there there's a beauty to that, right? I think you can gain a lot from that. But it wasn't until I started to work heavily in the world of contemporary opera, where there was no recordings, and I had to kind of base everything off of what was on the page.
Mhm.
Um, and I fell in love with that process. Fell in love with that process because I really felt like it allowed me to be the artist, rather than me trying to live up to some other artist, right? Um, I took that and applied it to uh, standard repertoire, and it has made every experience of singing standard repertoire so much more enjoyable for me, therefore inevitably more enjoyable for the audience and everyone that I'm singing for. In the past, it was always a daunting thing, and I was living, I was performing hoping to live up to the expectations that people had based off of other performances of it. But what I learned from contemporary music was that you should take every opportunity that you can to make and develop your standard, and to develop who you are and what your opinion is. Um, and I think there is a lot of storytelling and a lot of little nuggets of truth and identity within the music. Um, so I think uh, it's valuable a lot of times to listen, but hearing people's interpretation, you can kind of get distracted and lost with that. So what I've done is I hire someone to play the entire score, play everyone's
Mhm.
part, play, kind of like a repetiteur in an opera rehearsal, but it's not a rehearsal. Is the whole purpose of it is for them to just play through it, and I record it, or they record it if I'm away, and I will just listen to that. So it is, I get to be um, surrounded by the music and the themes, and because it's one thing to look at it, it's another thing to hear it, and then it's another completely other thing to look at it and hear it at the same
Mhm.
time. And I think there's so much value in that. So I have made it a habit of mine to, when I am performing any role, to part of my process is to do that. And once I have developed who I think this character is, and I have um, had practice and rehearsal with my opinion of it, um, I will take a little sneak peek to see what Herman Pry did, to see what
Mhm.
Dieskau did, to see what Dimitri and Bryn did. Um, and then I'm able to I don't know I'm able to appreciate what they did even more,
Mhm.
knowing what I did and what how I chose to interpret things, and looking at their work and going, oh, that's how they interpreted it. Oh, that's really interesting. Rather than starting with that and going in my mind subconsciously or consciously, oh, that's how it's supposed to be. So let me make sure. And then everything is shaped by that, and then you're lost, and then you create no identity. So that's my spiel.
So I'm enjoying, for many reasons, conversing with you, but one of them is because you trigger ideas in my head, which it's like drinking good coffee. Everything, the synapses start working and good connections happen. And one of them is, I don't know if you've ever come across a baritone. He's still very much alive and well, but he's no longer singing. In English, we would pronounce it Michael Melby. In Danish, it's Mikael Melbye, Melbye. And
Okay.
Michael, as I call him, is more or less my age. And he was a very fine lyric baritone who did a lot of the roles that I think you're going to do. He was perhaps the Papageno of his generation in the mid 80s, and he sang it at the Met, which is where I met him when I worked at the Met. He sang it for Von Karajan. He sang it at Salzburg, everywhere. And he was sort of the Papageno of choice. At a certain point, Michael decided that he sang the roles in the music that he wanted to sing, and he became a stage director and designer. And he comes from a multi-century family of painters and visual artists in Denmark. And the National Gallery of Denmark is full of paintings by Melboas who go back 200 years. And
Wow.
Michael always studied painting, and he at a certain point decided he would design his sets. And now he's the most famous portrait painter in Denmark. And what I find so interesting is that given his insight as someone who developed characters and roles, we were talking about this before with modeling, that he's on the other side. He's the painter, not the model. And I had him on this program perhaps 3 years ago, and I asked him to sit in his studio and put up whatever painting or whatever he wanted behind him, because even though we spoke for a long time of music, I wanted people to understand that visual artistic side of him. And so I'm going to introduce you. And next time you're in Europe, he lives between Denmark and Italy.
Wow.
I think you'll find a lot to inspire in one another. So just write that down. In the meantime, look for his Papageno. I think you'll find it very interesting because I think the one you described, where he's not just a silly idiot, though he could be very funny,
Mm-hmm.
but has a profundity, but without being Amfortas, for
Right.
example. um, is he very carefully balanced that
Wow.
divide between the joyous and the serious, which is what Mozart does in his music. I think Michael really beautifully understood the how the musical score informed his creation of his character, very
Mm-hmm.
much the way you described listening to the music of the whole score to
Right.
surround you as you evolve your character. Um, you are about to start, today being April 12th. Next week, you're going to do a project in New York with Denise Graves.
Yes.
Now, um, Denise Graves could read the news for me if she wants. She could read the phone
Mm-hmm.
book for me. Anything she wants to do, I'm happy for her to do it. So, really anything. She recently hosted the Met La Font finals. She was just the best host because there is a genuineness about her.
Right.
I mean, she's gorgeous and she dresses beautifully and she's a great performer and so on. But there is a genuineness and a no nonsense aspect of this mezzo thing. And here we go again, that gives an honesty to her performances that I simply love in whatever it is she does. Famously Carmen, but more recently in supporting roles in things like The Hours. Porgy and Bess, where she was just a magnificent Mariah
Hmm.
who cut fish on the stage while singing and and running the whole town. And she was just wonderful, but never hogging, never stealing, never calling attention to herself, just fully inhabiting the role vocally and dramatically and so on. So, that being said, I know nothing about the work Cotton except the title. Would you please tell me and the audience what it is, what you're doing, what Denise Graves is doing in it? It'll be at the 92nd Street Y here in New York City. It's not the world premiere, but it's the New York premiere.
Yes, I'm happy to tell you about it because it's one of the most extraordinary projects that I've ever worked on. We premiered it together. It was actually written for us, for Denise and myself, by composer Damien Jeter, who is also the composer of American Apollo, what we were talking about earlier. And we premiered it in Philadelphia with Lyric Fest, and then we went on to do another iteration of it at the Kennedy Center in Washington. And so this will be our um, our third performance of it, Denise and I. There was another performance of it that happened this year, but Denise and I weren't involved in it. Um, but this will be the New York premiere, and I'm excited for this audience to see it. It's basically photographer John Dowell has these extraordinary photos of Cotton, and him as an older Black man felt, I've never seen a cotton field. I would like to go to the South and just experience that. I think that's important for me. So he went, and surprisingly was moved by the beauty of the cotton fields and the plantations. And he decided that he was going to make art. And he tells these stories through his photography. And he has, for instance, he'll have a cotton field superimposed onto a photo of Wall Street. He'll have a plantation kind of side by side with a mom and shop business in Harlem. And these photographs just were deeply moving for the co-founders of Lyric Fest, who commissioned this song cycle. So basically, they took these photos and they sent them to a long list of established and not established poets to see who would be chosen to be basically the librettist of this song cycle. And they were so moved by the people who responded and the works of poetry that were created from it that they decided that they were going to choose all of them. And so each song in the cycle is by a different poet. And it is an array of poets from Nika Giovanni, to, at the time, I think she was a 17-year-old high school student that was just, interested in poetry. And Damien set each one of these, and it's there are 8 movements. Half of them are for the mezzo, and the other half are for the baritone. And because it was Denise and I premiering them, it had a perspective that we felt was profound in the fact that Denise and I are from 2 different generations.
Hmm.
but we're talking about the same thing, right?
Yeah.
We are from two different generations, but in a lot of ways we deal with the same things. And very much, very similar to someone like Nico Giovanni and the 17-year-old poet. So having these different perspectives surrounding the same topic, um, it was fascinating to see what happened and what people came up with, because there was no particular prompt other than pick a photo, write something about it, and then uh, the the poets being of African descent, uh, and the photography being featuring the South, and cotton fields. It evoked lots of typical things that you can imagine, but it also atypical things, um, joy and the heart of spirit of Black folk, and the beauty of the soul, as well as tragic things like trouble in the Middle Passage.
Hmm.
Um,
Would you,
be
because we're an international audience, would you define Middle Passage? I know what you mean, but please define
Yes.
that.
So basically, um, when sh when ships were transporting slaves from the African countries to what's now known as the U.S., um, there was a a section of the ocean that is defined as the Middle Passage, or identified as the Middle Passage, where it was a path that they would take to get from Africa to the Americas, and it's a really a troubling conversation, because more people died before more slaves died before they even got to America, than any other tragedy in the history of the world. You can't even count the amount of slaves that died in the Middle Passage. There were sharks in the ocean literally travel, um, in a different, it changed the trajectory of how sharks swim in the ocean. That is completely unnatural to where they should be swimming in the ocean, because they were going to the bodies that were being tossed overboard to feed on. And it's as you can imagine, it's a very terrible situation and story to tell. But it's a very important part of the history of the United States of America, and um, uh, one of the songs just briefly mentions it. Um, so you have an array of emotions and qualities, surrounding each one of these pieces, and how Denise interprets music is just not like anyone else.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that I was able to do this with her, um, it's really indescribable, how profound it was for me, to be able to work with her in general, but because I had actually worked with her before. Her and I performed Peter Grimes together at the Metropolitan Opera, and I was Ned Keene to her auntie,
I remember.
and so we have a lot of scenes together. So we've worked closely together before,
Mhm.
but there was something about this piece in particular, um, where we learned about each other in a very intimate and spiritual way that we would have never had an opportunity to working on something else. But I think it was this piece in general is a celebration of what it means to be American. I think it was the fact that we're performing, we premiered in Philadelphia, right? The significance of Philadelphia to the United States of America is um, uh, some, somewhat unparalleled. Um, and the fact that we premiered it there, the accompanist, also the co-founder of Lyric Fest and the co-commissioner of this cycle, Laura Ward, who's a brilliant musician in her own right, but her being a an American woman, us Denise and I being American or identifying as American, all of those poets that are all American, the composer being American, we're all collaborating on a story based off of the photography of of an artist who's American, and we're all telling this uniquely American story. I it was it to me it was a huge celebration of what what we have to offer to the world of classical music because you know it it has the reputation of being sometimes exclusively European, and what do we have to say? What do we have to contribute as Americans? And this is one of the gems I think in the classical music canon where there's no other place on earth that could tell a story like this. And thankfully, it's beautifully constructed from the first word to the last note. It's just extraordinary, and I'm excited for New York to hear it.
One brief context question. I know you were born in Germany. Did you, when you came to America, live in one spot more than another in this country, or did you sort of move around? I ask only because if you grew up, say, in Philadelphia as opposed to Atlanta, your experience about cotton might be different, even in
Absolutely.
big cities. But if we're talking
Right.
about rural places, where
Right.
did you grow up in one specific spot in the States?
So I grew up between Mableton, Georgia,
Hmm.
and New York City.
Yeah. So you know cotton.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I, it's the the perspective um from a New Yorker and someone living in the deep South could not be more different. And I am very, very, very um, grateful to have had the opportunity to live in both places,
Hmm.
and gain some understanding in real time of things that seem uh, just absolutely ridiculous on the news.
Um, Many persons of African descent who I know in this country, I grew up in New York City, have roots in the American South, sometimes urban, often rural.
Mm,
And if they live here in New York or Philadelphia, or New Jersey, they refer to down south as a cultural reference, not just about all the racial strife that was and sadly still is in our country, but about the richness of what the South gave them culturally and in terms of identity, musically, gastronomically, and more. Um, it sounds like you had a similar thing of having your New York City life and down south, whatever that meant.
absolutely. I think one of the beautifully rich things that I gained from uh, living down south was this sense of respect for one another. That, and I'm not saying New Yorkers or Northerners are disrespectful. It's just different. There is um, a consideration and almost reverence for your neighbor uh, down south that doesn't really happen, um, at least on the places that I've lived on the East Coast, unless unless there's some kind of like problem or issue, and then all of a sudden New Yorkers come together like no one else,
Yes,
and
it's true.
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Um, but there is a beauty, um, to that kind of southern hospitality
yeah.
that I have definitely tried to keep with me.
So Denise Graves, who you could tell I love, is from Washington, D.C. And President John F. Kennedy referred to Washington, D.C., then, not now, as a city of northern charm and southern efficiency.
Hmm.
And I think, I mean, I would want to ask Denise Graves, given the context you've just created, the table you just set, is she a northerner? Is she a southerner? Is where does she understand herself to be as relates to the songs in Cotton?
Right.
Never mind the larger picture that we could certainly get into. Do you have a guess on that?
I think she is, I don't know what she would say, but my personal opinion is she's the perfect combination of both.
But the good way, not the John F. Kennedy way.
No, no, right, the good way.
Southern charm and northern efficiency,
Exactly.
whatever that
Exactly.
is. So another question, because as I said, I'm delighting in the fact you trigger all these thoughts in my head. We were talking about the Middle Passage. Um, I'm honored to have a very dear friend who is the British Nigerian writer Ben Okri,
Mm,
who has won all the awards, the Booker Prize in England and so forth. He's a marvelous writer. He's a wonderful man. He had his birthday back in March. And we're always in touch, but especially on his birthday, and I reach
mm,
out to him. And he was on this program a couple of years ago when he had a new collection of poems come out. And I raised something that I know is delicate, but he and I really are friends, and I felt I could talk to him about this. Um, so many, to use another term, African Americans, especially from the South, but not only, have magnificent voices, whether they're singers or just speakers and so on.
mm,
My experience of people from Nigeria and Togo and Ghana, in other words, where many of the enslaved people were brought from, similarly have these extraordinarily gorgeous voices, whether they sing or just speak.
mm,
Ben has one of those voices. When he was on my program, I asked him to read poetry just because I love listening to him read poetry.
mm.
Um, I always wonder, and this is the difficult part of the Middle Passage issue, the people who survived and got to the American continents, whether there's a certain kind of distillation of that, call it genetic, whatever, magnificent voices that came from Western Africa
Mm.
to to America, to what became the United States. Um, because I can almost always, on listening, recognize the voice of a person of color, of African descent, um,
Mm.
without seeing that person. And it's not about accent because they can do a vocalese and I can recognize it. There's
Mm.
just a particular gorgeous quality that I warm to entirely. Um, has this ever come up in your thinking or in your conversation with people?
That is, wow, this is a very interesting conversation that I don't think I've ever heard anyone bring up outside of private conversations between Black people.
I know, but I grew up with
Because
Black people.
yeah,
I
it
did
comes up
really.
in,
Yeah,
yeah, it
yeah.
comes up in lots of different ways. Sometimes it comes up in a negative way. I won't name drop, but there's a very famous teacher, um, that was and still is affiliated with a very famous conservatory. Um, I won't say where because then you'll be able to narrow it down, and it's not about that. But she has a philosophy that the genetic makeup of people of African descent do not allow them the facility to sing opera or classical music, right?
Hmm.
So that's one, end of the spectrum, and the other end of the spectrum is um, how, at least the conversations I've had, there there is a stigma of having that black sound, right? And the there is a consensus that like the goal is to be able to be technically proficient enough to not have that black sound, right? And then there's another school of thought where black singers are the best singers in the world, and we want to have as much blackety blackness in our sound as possible. Because it's a moment of celebrating, the joy, and the triumph that black people have experienced, in within humanity. And I think that the fact that we and as African people, um, we're using our voices in a very musical way, to communicate, and singing was a part of the fabric of who African people were, and acoustically they were uh, kind of trained to project their voices in a particular way because they were outside, right? They didn't go inside to perform little concerts. Their big musical celebrations were outside with no help of walls or any kind of dome to carry the sound. They had to carry their sound within themselves. And it created a very particular style that is still celebrated to this day. And I don't know. It's so many facets of this conversation, I have been privy to, and I think it's all interesting. I don't necessarily have a clear defined opinion on that, because I personally, people have told me, you know I just love how black people sing, and you're an example of like why I love how black people sing, right? And then I've also heard, you know,
But I
some,
would never generalize like that.
right, but I mean, but
Because
people,
I
but
would say
I
I love how you sing because, as we've established already here, a singer brings his or her complete person to it and not just the vocal cords.
right, exactly, and I think
And therefore,
a
I
part
could
of
never
my
say that
black,
about all black or white or Asian or whatever. It would never
right,
occur to me to do that.
of course not, that's not what I'm, hearing from your question. But
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting within your question, to be able to voice a lot of these things that happen that a lot of people may not even be aware of. I have a particular very accomplished retired black singer from back in the day. Their biggest compliment to me was that I don't have a black sound. He's like, that's why you're going to have a career, because I listen to you, and I don't know what ethnicity you are, or I don't know or care if you're black or you're white, whatever. And I didn't really know how to feel about that. As I know they're trying to give me a compliment.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. It's fascinating, and I sometimes I just have to boil it down to, okay, thank you for the feedback. This is your perspective, and just leave it at that.
I think what I was trying to express about call them black voices across all music and also among people who just speak.
Hmm.
I've known people, black people, who I engage in conversation, and I know that they're a black person, even if I didn't see them,
Yeah,
not on accent, not on pronunciation, not on word choice, on sound, on
yeah,
resonance. There's a particular resonance, and I've heard many black singers. Only two of them you could have fooled me, and that would have been Kathleen Battle and Rary Grist. And they are
Mm,
at one end of the very high, pure, gorgeous lyric, I mean, more than lyric soprano, and where I wouldn't immediately know that.
mm,
But
hmm
every other male and female voice, whether they're singers or actors or anything, teachers, doctors, cooks, whatever. I mean, I grew up with a lady from South Carolina. She was from the Gullah people, for people who don't know what that is. That's
hmm
the low country. She could not read. She spoke in Gullah more than in English. She referred to it as Sus Carolina, and she was a wonderful person. She sang off key all the time, but she had this gorgeous voice that I love listening to her talk because it was so enveloping and so
mm,
beautiful. Her name was Rosa Lee. And it was just a gorgeous thing to be around
yeah,
because of her sound. And that was it. And she
right,
wouldn't know opera if she walked into an opera house. She just, that was
right,
not her world at all.
yeah,
She was a very kind, dear, simple, in the best sense person who was all heart. And
yeah.
there was that connection. And, we were talking before about the black sound. Um,
But
in
I
certain,
do know what you're talking about. I
yeah,
would be lying if I said that, that wasn't a thing, because I myself I've heard singers who aren't black
yeah,
um have a that kind of soulful sound, for the lack of a better term, and think in my mind, oh wow, she sounds black, or he sounds like he's black, and like, what does that really mean? But like, we can that's something that to unpack at another time. But
yeah,
I do know what you're talking
yeah. Um, and it brings up, frankly, another hero of mine. Because we're in this topic, it's no longer about singing. Um, I'm certain, know the name of the writer Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote The Warmth of Other Suns
about.
and Cast. I knew her not personally, but I knew her work when she was a journalist for the New York Times, based in the Chicago bureau. And people still read print editions, and I would read the Times every day. And she was someone, I had no idea if she was black or white. I just knew that Isabel Wilkerson wrote from Chicago, and I would read everything she wrote because of her writer's voice,
Mm-hmm.
not her speaker's voice. And when she then published these wonderful books that I recommend to everyone, um, The Warmth of Other Suns being about, quote, down south and the great migration north of rural black people to northern cities in America. Um, she defined not just black people's history, but American history with that. And Cast is a fascinating book now that she came out with recently about how social classes exist, whether in people of different colors or in India, where everybody is a shade of brown, but they're a caste, or Germany, where during World War II, and not only Jews were described as being othered, even though they may have been the same color as the Germans who did that. And then in America, where there's racism, I'll say was in the context of her book, but sadly it's still
Right.
here. Um, but the point is, Isabel Wilkerson, for me, and very few other journalists, as opposed to fiction writers, had such a magnificent writer's voice that
Mm.
I didn't know until she came out with The Warmth of Other Suns that she was black or
Wow.
white. I mean, I didn't establish that for myself.
Right.
When you read Toni Morris and you see photos, you know who she is in the context of her books, of course. But in the case of Isabel Wilkerson, who was a journalist and therefore not doing, quote, creative writing, but covering a fire or covering corruption at City Hall,
Mm.
she was doing journalism. And therefore her persona was did not enter into the journalism. And yet the writing was so gorgeous because I could see the fire that forced a family out of their home. I could
Mm.
see the mayor seething at being caught for his corruption.
Right.
And I mention this because there are singers, and I've only experienced you to a small amount, but I've already had the sensation about you, for whom you sing not only with your God-given voice as a singer, but with your writer's voice, if you know what I mean.
I do. I do.
Am
You
I
know,
on the right path at all or no?
what 100%, I think that um when you when you experience something that is beyond words, you have to express it in a different way. And I think that I sing because I am deeply connected to who I am and also who I want to be. Sorry, the my phone kind of cut off. I'm deeply connected to who I am and who I want to be and the pursuit of that. And I think something like music is a vehicle that is perfectly imperfect, and allows self-expression in a way that is just absolutely raw, and beautiful, and I think that, you know similarly to what you were saying before, I have a very close relationship with composer Ricky Ian Gordon, and we had a conversation once about how a lot of people, when they meet him for the first time, they are surprised that he's not black.
Yes. I've known
And
Ricky for decades. I know what you're saying.
right, and to be honest with you, when I first met Ricky, because I had known of his work more before I actually met him, I was surprised that he wasn't black as well, because he doesn't just set a lot of black writing, things like Langston Hughes, but there's a spirit, there's a soul in his writing that deeply resonates within blackness, and I know now that that is his um, experience growing up, being Jewish, right? And what that means, and the persecution even to this day, right? And also him growing up as a gay man and what that means, and the persecution of queer people up until this day. And how there are parallels, that connect, the two or the three, if you will. And I think it's no accident that he um, resonated with the poetry of Langston Hughes, and resonated with the plight of Black people in this country, and decided that he was going to um, dedicate a big portion of his art to it. And so I think similarly to Ricky, my experience as a person, a human being on this planet, but also my experience being uh, an American, but having that perspective of someone who wasn't born in the United States of America, right? Being um, uh, identifying as black, but someone who it took years to even understand what that meant, because when I was born in Germany and going to German kindergarten, and I didn't know I was black. I was like, what does that even mean, and then going from being alive at a very pivotal time in the country, going from it being a positive thing to be colorblind, to now understanding that being colorblind is the enemy, and we need to see color, we need to celebrate color. It's not enough to acknowledge our differences, we need to celebrate our differences, right? And invite people in. Um, I think all of that is allows me to uh, participate in the world of music in a profound way that is more than just, oh, listen to my pretty voice. It's not about my voice. It's, I tell when I do master classes, and when I work at companies and the young artist programs ask me to speak to their young artists, it's always a really special thing because I'm not so far removed from them. But I always tell them, it's not about how well you sing or how pretty your voice is. Your voice, it, imagine us all, we're all professional runners, right? And our voices are our running shoes, our sneakers, right? No one is at the start line looking at each other's shoes and going, "Oh, those are oh, those are Nikes. Oh, wow, oh, I like Adidas, and I like." No one cares. Run the race.
Mhm.
Focus on your race. Don't focus on what shoes you have on. Yes, they are important. Without the shoes, you couldn't run the race, right? So I get it that your voice is very important. But once you have developed your technique and you can't do anything about the voice you have. You have the voice you have. Now, what are you going to do with your voice? How are you going to run this race? What are you going to do about this race? What are you going to do with your voice? So that's kind of the message I try to kind of impart on them, because they're just, everyone is so fixated on, how do I sound? How do I sound? No, who are you? What do you
Mhm.
have to say? um, so I'll get off my soapbox.
Um, and it's this you and I will pick up another time because it's important. But I had the great honor and privilege and thrill of working a lot with Leontine Price, who referred to her voice as the voice, not because she was being Whitney Houston, but it's as if God had put it there and it was her
Right.
responsibility to take care of it. And it was not
Absolutely.
about who is Leontine, but her responsibility for this voice that God put there. And she loved her voice and still does, I'm sure. Um, I want to say about Ricky Ian Gordon, who was my guest on this show, that he wrote a wonderful, I think we call it a chamber opera, Intimate
Mm,
Apparel, based
yes.
on an absolutely wonderful play, and I'm forgetting the name of the playwright. She's won two Pulitzer Prizes.
Lynn Nottage.
Lynn Nottage, of course, who lives in Brooklyn, magnificent writer. And I saw this play when it was off Broadway at the Laura Pels Theater, and it had a young actress in it who I went up to her after and I said, Miss Davis, as in Viola, I think you have a big career ahead of you. She was, this was sort of her big break in New York. She was so magnificent in the central character. You were in Ricky Ian Gordon's opera version of Intimate Apparel. It was
Yes.
fabulous. You were
Thank,
fabulous. It was fabulous.
thank you.
Forgive me, I'm forgetting the name of the lovely singer who sang with you,
Yes. Kirsten Piper Brown.
Kirsten
Yes.
Piper Brown, of course.
One of the Esthers. Chabrelle Williams was another Esther, but yeah.
I saw Kirsten Piper Brown, and this was one of those works that I bought a ticket for a long time ago because I didn't know any of the performers, but I knew Ricky and I knew the
Mm,
play, and it was canceled or postponed because of the COVID pandemic. And then
right.
finally, you all got to do it, and I was thrilled to see it. Um, in a small theater in the Round at Lincoln Center at the Mitzi Newhouse Theater, and therefore when you're performing in that kind of round space and you're acting and you're in period costume, to what degree are you aware of the audience right there? It was kind of a darkened theater, but there were a lot of scene changes going from a, a fabric shop to a place where women lived and to your being the groom who meets her by correspondence um and I was in the front row and often you were like 2 inches away from me. And are
Right.
you aware of the audience when you're in that kind of space, or can you really just remain in character? It's not like you have a proscenium arch in the opera house.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. It's a really good question because for the first time in my career, there I had to. try to find a balance of not being aware but also being aware. When on a normal, operatic stage, whether it's a proscenium or not, you're not. I do a lot of work at Opera Theater St. Louis, and they're not a proscenium, but they're not as close as you are in the Mitzi Newhouse Theater. And I'm able to really stay in the world of the piece, stay in the mind of the character, and not think about the audience at all. Um, but in the Mitzi Newhouse, the audience is so close that if you if you don't keep them in mind, it could be dangerous, and you could it could also throw the whole production off. For
Yeah.
instance, there I'll name three examples. The first example is the people who are in the uh, front row center. Their toes are literally on the stage, are they're on the turntable, right? So if someone puts their foot out just slightly, you could trip one of the actors.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to sort of be aware of that kind of safety stuff. Also, you have to be aware, like there are a couple of entrance. The second example, there's an entrance that I have through one of the bombs,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the
Bomb, for people who
like,
don't, being these sort of upward ramps that come from within the theater to the stage, but from
yes,
underneath the audience to the stage.
exactly. And I guess one of the patrons of the evening didn't realize that people would be entering from the VOM, uh, and she had her coat on the railing, and the coat fell in the middle of the performance. So one of our incredible cast members, who was in the ensemble, um, during the vendor scene where they're talking, and selling items, to people on the street, she goes over and picks up the lady's coat and gives it to her, and in character, but it was such a brilliant way to handle that situation, right? Because the practically, yes, I mean, yes, it was nice for her to give her coat back, but practically that area needed to be clear because there's a bed that has to roll out on stage through that vom that would have totally been ruined
Yeah.
if that coat was in the way, right? So that's an example. There was there's a scene where I exit off another vom while singing a high A. So I'm exiting through the vom off stage, and I'm focused on my core because not only am I singing a high A, but I'm singing a high A while I'm walking on a rotating set. But
Mm-hmm.
I can't rotate with the set. I have to walk straight, which means I have to sort of kind of walk to the left a little bit so that it could seem like I'm walking straight. And then I get off the vom. I'm sorry. Then I get off the rotating table. So that has to be graceful. I can't just like jerk as if I just got off of an escalator or something. So I'm focusing on trying to, maneuver all of that. And then someone drops their Macy's shopping bag
Oh,
on my head, on my head as I'm sick. I'm like, I can't work like this. I've never had to do like, but it happens. It's live theater, right?
yeah.
So yeah, there you are absolutely aware. That's a very long-winded way of saying that. Yes, you are absolutely aware of the audience in a theater like that.
But the audience is also, if they're good, aware of their responsibility. When I saw you do this, I was what you would call stage left, house right, in the front row,
Okay.
near the sewing machine in a couple of the scenes,
Right.
not the side that has the table where all the fabric is laid out, but the
Okay.
other side,
Right.
where one of the doors is where the rooming house, for lack of a better word,
Mm-hmm.
where Esther lives, was there. So the scene where you would come in and the bed was very close to me.
Okay.
And therefore, and for people who don't understand this, just acknowledge that an audience member could be practically in bed with the artist, and I practically
Yes.
was.
Right.
It's a responsibility because number one, Not that I would have fallen asleep there, but let's say I had not gotten to bed
Mm,
the night before and was really tired.
right.
Um, number one. Number two, audience members really have to focus on things like toileting before because you can't get
Mm-hmm.
out. And if you are uncomfortable, it also depends on what you eat before or don't eat. Many people don't think of this. I
Right.
always do.
Right.
If someone is diabetic, I'm not, but if someone's diabetic and needs suddenly an energy boost, and you have to open a wrapper to get the food to
Right.
do that, all of this has to be done carefully
Absolutely.
because not only the actors can see you, the other audience members can see you.
Right.
And you
Right.
can the upstairs of that same building is where Patti LuPone, the famous Broadway star, famously reamed out an audience member who took something out of a purse and
Mm,
looked like a cell phone, but it was not, and the show came to a halt.
right.
So it's I say this because I want people listening who are audience members as opposed to performers to understand we're all in this together,
Right.
and that the artist brings so much work and effort and everything that Justin has described so eloquently today in terms of goes into a performance. But we audience members, it's not passive, it's not television. It's
Mm,
not where you can suddenly comment, as I've heard people often do, saying, um, that's a nice dress. I'll tell you a
right.
very famous story because I was present for it. Um, Daniel Craig, James Bond and so on, who turns out to have gorgeous blue eyes. I saw him in a tiny theater, even smaller than what we're talking about here, doing Iago opposite the Othello of David, and I cannot pronounce his last name, Oyolaway. You know who I
Okay.
mean?
Yeah.
Oyolaway. Um, and they were in this very intimate space doing Othello and Iago. And when
Hmm.
Iago gets killed, or stabbed and he will die, Daniel Craig fell on the feet of the woman next to me and opened his eyes because his character died. And there was Daniel Craig basically stretched out next to me with his head on her feet. And I mean, he's an incredibly fit man. He was wearing a tight t-shirt that rose up a bit and we saw his navel and so on. And this woman said, I think he could lose 5 pounds right out loud. While Daniel Craig was looking up at us. And I I just bit my lip, and what could I say? And
Wow.
I couldn't look at him. I didn't want to
Right.
trigger anything in him. I couldn't look away, and she said it loud enough that everybody heard
Right.
us around there. And that's when Othello was going into his own death spiral, and Desdemona was
Mm,
dead, and Emilia was the only one left. And audience members don't realize
right.
sometimes. And
Exactly.
it is our job to be prepared, to read the program, to listen to the
Right.
music ahead of time. In the case of a play by Shakespeare, read the play,
Right.
bone up, be prepared, so that if Iago suddenly falls at your feet, focus on that's Iago and not Daniel Craig with his t-shirt
Right.
slightly pulled up. He looked terrific. But this woman thought he could lose 5 pounds. It was only 5 pounds. It's not 50
Right.
pounds. But
That's
anyway,
so funny. I mean, every performance, um, and this wasn't from people that in the front row. These people that are just like sitting in the house. Every performance of Intimate Apparel, there were multiple people that would, make comments about whatever was happening, right? Oh, she's pretty. Oh, like you said, I love that dress. Oh, how could he do that to her? Oh, whatever. They're just, in the moment, kind of commenting on what they're seeing. We hear all of it
oh yeah.
on stage. We hear every single thing, especially in that theater. We heard everything, and I guarantee you, people had no idea that we heard them, but we did. So be careful.
I for many, many years, and as recently as a few weeks ago, um, do a lot of speaking and teaching at Brooklyn Academy of Music, which is a
Mm,
wonderful historic theater in Brooklyn. And it has been refitted a bit. And the room where I speak, which holds about 400 people, um, has a very particular acoustic in that
mm,
I can hear everything that every person says. And
Wow.
when the manager or whoever it is introduces me first and gives the request to turn off your cell phones, he or she always says, and please don't talk because the speaker can hear everything you say.
Right.
And early
Right.
on, it would be things like, gee, he's interesting, or gee, maybe, the green is not his color, or whatever. But sometimes, let's say I'm speaking about La Forza del Destino, as I did
Hmm.
recently, and someone said, the story is too complicated. I don't think he's explaining it well. Well, give me a chance.
Right.
It is a
Right.
complicated story. And I don't know, it's something about, I love the communing of live performances, whether it's speaking, teaching,
Mm.
singing, dancing, opera, whatever, theater, because it is a sacred space. You were talking before about how in Western Africa people sang out of doors, and but in ancient Greece they performed out of doors. But at a certain point, buildings were erected all over the world where we gather, whether they're churches or theaters or anything else, that are within. And to me, these are sacred spaces
Mm.
as much as the Parthenon in Athens or anything else. In terms of, this is where we gather as humans, and this is where we exchange. Zoom and the internet have become this in recent times. And you and I have had, I think, a wonderful conversation. I've loved it
Same.
about so many things. And we have witnesses who not only are experiencing it on April 12th, but can experience it in the future. And it's a different kind of gathering. I don't know how sacred it is, but it's another means for the rat race, for the confusion, for all the noise that happens in our political and social world and war and all everything, to take a break from that and to have maybe something that provides inspiration or knowledge or a laugh every so
Right.
often. Um, and that is my polite way of saying, my friend, that we have to conclude here. But I hope, look forward. I've seen you in performance. I hope to actually talk to you in person sometime. I commend to listeners everything that Justin Austin is doing. What I've seen him in, I've loved him in. And he's up there with great artists all the time who, believe me, I said this at the beginning, everyone says, have you seen or have you heard Justin Austin? And this has not happened in my career since the beginning of Thomas Hampson, where there's just this conversation about what you do that
Wow.
inspires people in your profession and my profession. So I thank you.
I thank you, Fred. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for, stimulating conversation and for allowing, me to have this platform to talk a little bit about what I do.
May we do it again in other places in front of live people.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Justin Austin.
Thank you.